Okay, so we talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal. And you really do need to listen to the lectures because there's a lot of stuff on there that's not necessarily going to be on PowerPoints. And for one thing, I didn't have a PowerPoint at all for the Great Depression leading up to the New Deal time. So I kind of put one of those together really quickly. So I'm going to talk about it more on the audio. So what's going on here is we're going to talk about the causes of the Great Depression that I've picked to talk about because there's so many, and historians have kind of argued about those for a long time. And if you talk to economists, they're going to pick out certain things. If you talk to historians or you talk to people from the legal world or people from different aspects, they're going to pick out different things. So what I picked out are, basically the five ones that I've always looked at from the historical perspective as causing the main, actual breakdown that gives us the Great Depression. And you'll notice that some of mine might be a little bit different than what you've heard, and some of the things I say might be a little different than what you'll find if you go and you Google this stuff. And that's a result of history and study and the fact that scholars and historians and everyone, we all have different, slightly different takes on it, like I said. So let's get started talking about the Great Depression and then the New Deal. So again, here's my five that I pick out as big ones because they're important. So the first one is the United States refusal to diversify. Now, what I mean by that is they're going to be putting so much of their money in terms of production into two things, okay? As construction, building of new homes, and automobiles, okay, building of cars, and everything that goes with that, all of the peripheral things that go with building, say, cars, like we've talked about before, oil and gasoline and glass and all that, and steel, and same thing with the home market. So we were pretty much dependent upon those two things in our economy. And still to this day, if you look at, if you see if you pay attention, okay, you see the economic reports and you see that new home sales and new car sales are down for a period of time, that could be a signal that we're going into at least a recession or a downturn in the economy. Now, as I'm recording this in, April of 2020, things are artificially reset as we're in the middle of a lockdown across the nation, and we see that that's artificial. It doesn't just happen organically that people stop spending money right now in 2020, and that's hurt the economy greatly. But in the Great Depression, these are all things that are going to culminate in giving us what becomes more than a decade of a horrific economy and a very slow recovery in many ways. Okay, so that you see the United States refusing to really diversify into a lot of different directions. We're basically dependent on building and cars. Okay, so number one. Number two, we have a crisis with the farmers. Now, the farmers were already in the 1920s, they were already having crises as far as being able to make ends meet. You see, that's going to be, again, one of the causes, because as they can't sell their crops at the same rate or more than they had before, then a lot of the farmers are not going to be able to pay their bills. See, the farmers, sometimes they're going to have mortgages on the farm. Sometimes they took extra mortgages in order to buy some new farming equipment. And so sometimes they can't pay the bank. They can't pay the mortgage. They take their house. If they couldn't pay for the equipment, they'll take the equipment. And either way, you end up with the farmers in a really bad spot during the 1920s. So, I mean, really, if you look at it honestly, you're going to see that the Roaring Twenties, the time period that is preceding the Great Depression, was going to be terrible for the farmers in so many ways because of them constantly being in debt, constantly worrying about if they were able to make their payments on things. So this had happened after the World War, and we see that a lot of the demand had dropped for the farmers' goods. And part of that is going to be because of well, in Europe, where they had imported some things from the United States, the Europeans are not going to be able to afford to buy really anything from the United States for quite a while because they're trying to pay back their bills. That was one reason Woodrow Wilson had said he wanted a lenient peace with Europe. He didn't want to destroy their economy, even, the enemies. He doesn't want to destroy their economy. So in the middle of World War One, you're going to see all kinds of different machines that had been developed and all kinds of things that had caused the farmers again to go out and purchase things to give them more crop diversity themselves. They thought that would make them more money, but there's some other factors that are going to play into that. And even though they were able to get their crops out really quickly, a lot of the men that were needed on the farm, the what do they call them? The farm hands, I think, the men that would work for the farmers, they don't need as many of them because they have more machines doing the muscle work, the actual work of the farm. So the money that the farmers are making had begun to decline in the 1920s. And the United States was trying really hard to sell what we have, just goods and everything. We were trying really hard to sell these things over to Europe, but there's going to be a lot of reasons that doesn't work. And I mentioned the one being the economy had been really impacted in Europe. So, I mean, the agricultural crises, the farmers' crises in the United States in the 1920s that's leading up to this Great Depression has to do with overproduction of crops, has to do with a lot of the men simply not needing help on the farm. So that puts those guys out of jobs. And really a lot of the supply and the demand from Europe. And after World War One, just the lingering fears and everything else that replaced the old way of life. It was the new normal. So number three. Well, number three is the wealth gap. Okay, we talked about that in the 20s. We talked about so many people living in poverty in the 1920s. And we saw that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. And that's not an uncommon thing to see through history. So in the 1920s, this wealth gap is going to start to get really prominent, okay, as you're going to see the wealthiest 1%, their income is going to rise by 75%. Think about that. In the 1920s, the roaring 20s, where half of Americans live, under the poverty level, you've got the wealthiest 1% having a rise in their income of 75%. Now, the rest of the United States, working class and workers and salaried people, are only going to see an increase of tops about 9 to 10%. Okay? Now, again, so many people were already living in poverty in the 1920s. It's going to get worse, and the wealth gap is going to continue to get worse because no matter what, whether it's the Great Depression or whether it's anything else, there are going to be some people who are going to make money. There's just always going to be some of those, and we'll talk about some of those who are going to make some money during the Great Depression, but you're going to see, again, the wealthiest 1% are going to find new and unique ways to get more income. Part of that, I'll just tell you now, part of that's going to be from Hollywood. have Joe Kennedy, for example. He's going to be in on kind of the ground floor of Hollywood. And in the 1920s and then the 1930s, as people get into the Great Depression, if you make a lot of movies and you put them out and they're actually relatively cheap, quite a few people are going to take what little entertainment money they might ever get a hold of, and they're going to go see a movie. So movies are going to be a big business in the 1930s, especially with, the people looking for something to take their minds off the reality of the Great Depression. So we have then for number 4, speculation in the stock market, and of course, the confidence in the businesses that the stock market represents. We have a lot of investors that are putting money into the stock market. And what happens there at some point is they think it's going to keep getting bigger and bigger, and I'm going to make more and more money from investing in the stock market. Well, usually we call that a speculative bubble because we're speculating as to the fact that this particular thing I'm investing in is going to continue to get more and more valuable. And sometimes we simply over speculate. Okay, that happened in the early 1990s. We had the dot-com, the dot-com as in, .com, dot-com speculative bubble that burst, and you had the housing crisis. People were speculating in the lower cost loans of housing, and you're going to see this happen in the 1920s in the stock market. So eventually the bubble's going to burst because the businesses' costs are going to go up. So the businesses are selling stocks, right? Remember how that works. The stock market, so the businesses themselves are going to need more capital. They're going to need more to invest. And so people keep investing more in these businesses. Well, the problem is the costs are also going up. And it gets to a point where the costs have gotten so high for their capital that they need to keep producing that they're no longer going to make a profit. So that ends up being a major issue, of course, okay, in terms of the stock prices and everything else. So the money that we use, money can be printed, money can be inserted into the economy, but because it's not real money that's it's being artificially created and inserted out there, you're going to see a rise of what we call inflation. Okay, inflation. I don't know. So what is inflation then? You need to kind of have a working thing in your mind as to what inflation is. Now, something like a paraphrased textbook definition that I would just say would be inflation is something that you can measure. Okay, it's something we can actually measure, and we're measuring the rate at which the price level of whatever goods and services we're measuring increases over some period of time. Okay, I don't know if I could say that exactly the same way, so if you need to, take that back a few seconds and listen to it again, do that, because I don't think I could say it in those exact words again. But anyway, it's something measurable, and it's something that we're measuring based on certain things in an economy, and those prices are going to increase over a period of time. So in other words, when you have inflation, let's say we have $1, the dollar is going to buy a lot more, just a regular dollar, in the year 1920 than it buys in the year 2020. Okay, the dollar is going to buy a lot more in the year 1985 than it does in the year 1998. Okay, inflation. Inflation is this increase in this general price level of goods. Okay, so inflation's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you have to have healthy inflation. It's the growth of the dollar, and inflation can incur from all sorts of different reasons. I mean, one I just mentioned was production cost. Okay, the capital, what it cost for you to get the raw materials to invest in whatever you're creating, and also how much you have to pay your workers. Okay, so that's the basics of what inflation is. Now, the government, if they give more credit, they say, well, we want to give more credit to businesses. We want to help them start new businesses, or pay their bills or whatever. They give some artificial means at that point. Then this is going to be, well, like I said before, you're not getting real wealth from that. You're getting credit. So if something happens and you have spent all that money on, or all that credit rather, on improving your business, or whatever, then you're going to be in trouble if you don't make a big profit and you're not able to pay back your debts, okay, as a business. So we see between the farmers, who are having a lot of foreclosures, and the companies, the corporations who are not making profits, we're going to start to see the money doing some strange things. Okay, we're going to have inflation, yes. We're going to have, though, such a low demand that's coming, because there's going to be this whole process of what happens. Okay, so if you're not getting real wealth, and like I said, it's artificial, and the speculation ends, okay, people are not investing as much in the stock market as they did, you're not able as a business or corporation to make a profit like you were in order to pay back the banks. Okay, the corporations and the farmers are going to help, or cause, I guess, have an effect on banks closing. Now, the small banks, the local banks, had heavily invested in local farmers. So they're going to be hit hard first. And then as the bigger corporations and businesses are unable to pay back their credit to the bank, their debts to the bank, then you're going to see that the bigger banks start to close and it spreads. Okay, so keep that in mind. And in 1929, okay, Black Thursday, which was on October 24th of 1929, you're going to have an incredible decline in the stock market. So I want you to know that the crash of the stock market in October of 1929 was a symptom of what was going on. Okay, so this burst of the bubble and the ensuing crash, it's considered by some economists, of course, to be a cause of the Great Depression. But most historians, we're going to look at it a little bit more broadly, and we're going to say, well, it made it worse. Okay, in my opinion, the crash of the stock market in October of 1929 was a symptom of a very bad economy that was on very weak footing, actually. And as it actually did crash, as we see Black Monday on October 28th then coming, and we see October 29th, 1929, being the worst day, you're going to see a total drop in Black Monday on October 28th, Black Tuesday on October 29th, of about 23 or 25% in the stocks. Okay, so you're going to have some very wealthy people who are going to come out and they're going to try to buy a lot of stocks to show that they still believe in the market. Hey, we think it's going to be great. So some of the wealthy families, like the Rockefellers and some others, they're going to say, look, we're buying. Well, that doesn't work, because you and me, average people, we know we're not the Rockefellers or any of the others that are going to participate in this. And so they do trade a lot of stocks on the 29th. And then on October 30th, as we've heard recently, when we've had some very low points of the stock market, you'll hear that sometimes the stock market will rally. Well, it did. It rallied a little bit on October 29th, but it's going to continue to just crash. Okay, so it's not going to return for another, what is it, maybe 25 years? Let's see, something like 25 years till it ever gets back to the point that it was at the time of the highest mark, which would have been in September of 1929. So again, you can't blame the stock market for all of this, because the stock market would not have crashed had it not been for all the other stuff going on. Particularly, again, don't forget that speculative bubble, the speculation, the idea that if you buy something, that it's going to continue to get more and more valuable. Okay, don't forget that, because when you invest in anything today, like a house, real estate, you're going to assume that it's going to become more valuable. And so when they started with the stock market, when they started selling because they were afraid that they were going to lose their money, and then everyone else kind of follows, it's going to be at that point the Great Depression and the stock market crash coming together. They've almost become synonymous in so many people's minds. And some people blame it on the banks. Well, as I said, the banks are closing because of the things that we already mentioned, okay? The farming crisis, and then the corporations that weren't really making as much money and profit and all that. Now add to all of this the fifth one, okay? So the fifth one that I pick is the international debt structure. Now, as I said, Woodrow Wilson had wanted to give a lenient peace settlement. Woodrow Wilson was outvoted. Remember, they didn't want to do that. So, and by they, I mean the Allies. So we end up with a couple things that happen here, okay? Europe has been devastated because the war happened boots on the ground in Europe. And Europe, their economy is a mess. It's even worse, I guess, in some ways than what we're seeing in the United States at that point, because of as I said, the actual action of the war being conducted right before that, right before the 20s on their soil. So the international debt structure is very strange at that point. So again, you see that the the fact that Europe couldn't pay back the Allies many of their debts, that's going to cause problems not only with Europe and the European countries because they're defaulting on their debts. It's going to cause problems with the Allies as we're not getting paid back. And it's unstable because excuse me, the Allied countries in particular are going to owe money straight out to the United States. And again, it's hard for them to pay it back because their economies had been torn apart by World War I. So we're not getting the money back that we invested in our allies. We're not going to be able then to meet our obligations in the United States. So it becomes an incredible nightmare for everyone for, again, more than a decade. So slide number 5 is exactly what it says. This is an approaching black blizzard in 1937. Famous picture here of some cars and wagons in South Dakota in 1936 that had been buried by one of those terrible dust storms. Here's a map where you get some of the information about where the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles were hit so hard. And you can just look at kind of the areas and how they were damaged and to the extent and where it hit. I like elections. I like politics. I think it's all really, really crazy and illustrates everything that is wrong sometimes with humanity and some of what's right with humanity. But here comes another election, the election of 1928, which is going to be a really important one because what Herbert Hoover does not know when he's elected here is that he's going to be the one who is president when the Great Depression strikes and the Roaring Twenties ends. And when I say that many people blame the president, we're talking about the president who was elected in 1928, and that is Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the Republican nominee, and Al Smith, the governor of New York, was the Democrat nominee. So there's a lot of different things going on in this election, and you can see we'll talk about some of them. So first of all, we have the issue of the Democrat Party putting forth their nominee as Al Smith as a Catholic. So religion became a big deal. Now, he was also an opponent of prohibition, which means he did not want prohibition. He didn't want to ban the sale and transport and everything of alcohol. So he had picked a running mate who was a Protestant who also wanted prohibition. So, again, like we've talked about all semester, usually the presidential nominee will pick a vice presidential candidate that will sort of even it out. Okay. But the Democrats were really split on prohibition. And when we talk about, we say religion became an issue. Well, religion was an issue because there had never been a Roman Catholic elected or a Catholic elected president. And I didn't know this until fairly recently. But I mean, by fairly recently, I mean as a grown up at some point, that America has many, many Catholics, but America also has a pretty long history of anti Catholicism. Okay. Now, what happens then because of that is there's rumors that are going around. You've got preachers from the Protestant denominations in some of the country going up there. And this is, again, pay attention to this because this is also an example of the class of cultures we already talked about in the Roaring Twenties. Okay, here's another example of that conflict of cultures or clash of cultures. You're going to have a lot of Protestant preachers in the countryside. They would go and they would vote, they would go into their churches and they would tell their congregations that if they voted for that Catholic man, this was a vote for the devil. Okay? So you're going to have the resurgent KKK. Remember, the KKK is going to be anti just about everybody. Okay? They're very white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So, of course, they're against Catholics too. So they start to put out all this literature that claims all these crazy things like if we elect a Catholic president, he's going to take orders from the Pope instead of, doing what the Constitution says, that a Catholic Protestant or a Catholic Protestant, Lord, y'all, I'm tired again, but that a Catholic president would actually do things like establish Catholicism as the nation's official religion. Now, we know that none of that is constitutional. The fact that the KKK spread out, like when he was having a rally at one point, he was, well, I think he was going to a rally. There was something where Al Smith was at a rally, and I think it was about religious tolerance, I believe. And I guess the irony of that I always see that's really so wild is that the KKK surrounded the place where the rally was being held and they burned crosses outside. So while he spoke, you had people, yelling at him and heckling him, all sorts of things. There was also a speech that came the next evening, in that same place, the same venue that was called, get this, Al Smith and the Forces of Hell. All righty then. Okay. So you've got all of that going on with religion and prohibition becoming the biggest issues. So, election of 1928 also, Herbert Hoover is going to take credit because the Republicans, the party of Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge, remember, and Warren G. Harding, that he's taking credit because the 20s are so prosperous. And he said that he would keep it going and growing and getting better all the time and all that kind of stuff. Now, Hoover, for his part, wasn't really out on the campaign trail all the time. He didn't give a lot of speeches. He only gave a few, but the ones he gave were well timed and they were well rehearsed, and I guess did some did some good. But you know what's happening is really the Democrats are split. Again, all the anti-Catholic sentiment is going to hurt Smith, of course. The rumors that I mentioned on the other slide about all the crazy things. I don't even think I mentioned that one of the rumors was that he would annul all Protestant marriages. I mean, it was insanely out there, this election. Now, again, I think all of them are. If we look back at all of them, I think that they are all just wild. But interesting things going on here. The Democrats are split on prohibition, and the Democrats also are going to have some splits with Catholicism. So we've got the Democrats not really uniting under Al Smith, which means usually when that happens with one party or the other in our two-party system, you're going to have the other party that's more unified elected, and that's where we get Herbert Hoover, okay, on the heels of Coolidge and all of that. But he's not going to be as lucky as he thinks he is probably on Inauguration Day, because when the Great Depression hits, he's the one in charge. Now, Hoover very famously at one point had, and this came back to just haunt him all the time, he had said that we were closer, and I'm paraphrasing this, that we were closer to eliminating the poorhouse, closer to getting rid of poverty in this country than we had ever been before. And he said that about, I think it was 8 or 9 months before the stock market crash of 1929. So anyway, poor Herbert Hoover. You're gonna hear a lot from the people about how it's his fault. And to be honest, he doesn't do much to help. He doesn't want to spend enough money, for one thing, on relief. That's going to be part of it. He's going to do some other strange economic moves. But what we start to see is, again, the homelessness is going to rise. We're going to have people that have lost their homes and they're sleeping literally wherever. They're living in shanty towns, they're called shanty towns. And sometimes, and that means that you built a place like a lean-to out of whatever you could find, something to keep the rain off you, pretty much. And a lot of them call those little shanty towns, they call them Hooverville, okay, or Hoovervilles, plural. Very famous photographer, she will become a very famous photographer, Dorothea Lange, is going to take these pictures. At least I believe she takes all of these pictures. I know 100% that she takes the one on the top right called called Migrant Mother. Goodness. And the woman in the picture in the top right, her name is Florence Thompson. And supposedly she was kind of upset that she became one of the faces of the Depression. And the picture, you can see part of it. And there's other shots from that same, I guess there's other shots from that same kind of few moments in time. But she has, I believe, 4 children hanging on her. And she's not even very old. I don't remember if she's still in her 20s, barely in her 30s. But you can tell that the depression's taken a toll on her. And then, of course, we see the guys on the Dust Bowl on the top left, showing the soil. And at the bottom, we see a guy standing outside of a store with signs on it, and you can look at the signs, coffee and hamburgers and stuff. But again, a lot of people didn't have money to even buy those things that may have been 2 cents or 5 cents or whatever. So, onset of the Great Depression, again, there's Herbert Hoover. He tries to stop the failing economy after the stock market crash. He does several things, and some of them are probably better than others. Some of them are maybe less harmful than others. But for one thing, we've already mentioned the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It was put in place to help the farmers in particular. And we're also going to see him issuing something that you'd call voluntary cooperation. So, what he asked from the people was, well, he tried to make sure that the people weren't really scared about the crash. He tries to get all these people to the business leaders and the owners, the corporations, and everybody to get. He tries to get them together, and he asks them to to base. And he's not ordering this. This is why we call it voluntary cooperation. But he asked them to basically not lay off any workers and don't cut any wages. Now, he does that thinking that it's not going to be, this Great Depression, because we've had depressions, we've had panics. We've mentioned those in here in the class many times. Okay, there was the Depression that came early, 1920 and 1921, after World War One. We know that. So Hoover's going to ask them not to fire anyone, not to cut their wages. He also has the railroads spending more money on construction. Okay. So money that maybe could have been saved and maybe used for other things. But he's trying to do what he thinks is right. And he doesn't want to put out any public spending. Again, he's not willing to spend the kind of money it would take to really make a difference. So he's going to watch as the banks start failing. He's going to watch as people end up by 1930 on a organization for unemployment relief, because we don't have unemployment insurance in 1930. Okay, that's going to come later. So he's kind of put together this group, this organization is trying to figure out how to coordinate the money for people who are unemployed through local means. Again, he doesn't really want to get the federal government really too much involved in this. So he had a lot of different things that he tried. But as it continues, it's going to get worse and worse. And by the time we get to the election of 1932, which is going to involve Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, you're going to have one incident that's really pretty big. Now, another thing I noticed when I look at the slide is Herbert Hoover also believed that Americans did not want to be on the dole. I've got that in quotes because that was an expression at the time. The dole was taking a check from the government, and that was said to be shameful. You just can't do that. So anyway, the event though that's really tragic is called the Bonus Army. Okay, sometimes they call themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force or something like that, right? So these were World War I veterans and their families that came to Washington, D.C. in the summer before the election of 1932. They had been promised a bonus of $1,000 to them that would be paid in 1945. So they wanted their money, but they wanted it right then. They didn't want to wait until 1945. They were hungry then in 1932. So they decide that they're going to set up camp there in Washington until someone listens to them. So the police come out and they try to, get rid of these World War I veterans by scattering them out. But the police, there's not enough of them. And so the police are going to actually fire some shots, we think, in the air at first to try to get the protesters to calm down and to disperse. Well, we know that at first we have a couple of protesters that are killed, and it gets worse and worse, and a lot of police officers are injured. So here's where Hoover comes in. Hoover sends the United States Army into these protests the protests are by World War I veterans. This is probably not a good look, right? Now, it turns out that the Army, the ones that he sends in, they're going to be led by a guy, General Douglas MacArthur, who you hear about again in World War II, but also Dwight Eisenhower, who will become a famous general in World War II. He will also become the next Republican elected, not until 1952, after Hoover. And then, of course, George Patton, who's going to become a great general. So Douglas MacArthur went in there with all kinds of passion, and he clears out the protesters. He clears out, there's some buildings that they had been squatting in, there's places that they had lean-tos, and Douglas MacArthur and his troops are going to run the World War I veterans out of Washington, D.C. Okay, so this is probably the crowning touch, the fact that they had attacked World War I veterans, that he's got really no chance of being reelected. The election of 1932 had Herbert Hoover, because he was indeed the incumbent president. Very rarely are they going to remove an incumbent president from the party ticket. But you've got Herbert Hoover running against the Democrat, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is going to be the leader of the New Deal. Remember, he had run before as a vice presidential nominee or candidate back with James Cox. You might remember that. But he's going to be elected on his own as president in 1932 for the first of 4 elections. Okay, he's going to be elected 4 times. It's something that we had to take care of in the Constitution later to prevent that from happening again. But here we go with the New Deal. On slide 14, we're going to be talking about the Tennessee Valley Authority. But before we do that, I want to mention something that's not on the slide. I want to mention the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. Now, this is going to be one of the New Deal agencies. Is going to be set up by FDR when he first comes into office as president. Okay, so he's going to, within his first 100 days, he's going to change things around by spending a lot of money and setting up a lot of new, administrations, committees, different ways to help, or at least to plan what they're going to do to help. Now, the NRA was very important, okay? The National Recovery Administration. So what they were trying to do was they were trying to bring industry, the factories and so on, labor, and the government together and figure out ways to set prices. And they were trying to stop these people who were price gouging, for example. So, we all know that the market, capitalism, the marketplace is sometimes you're going to have people that simply charge a lot more for the same item than other people. If you go, I know there's one particular brand of something that Zach likes, and we were getting it at Walmart for him from Walmart for him for a while. And then I went to another store, and it was literally like less than half price. So, and it was the exact same thing. So what they were trying to do with the National Recovery Administration was to set up codes where it would be fair competition instead of having, other people go out there and sell things at bigger prices. Now, another thing they're working with here, though, is to set minimum wages and maximum weekly hours. Okay, so we're used to having a minimum wage now, but it's not going to be until the Great Depression in the United States that we actually do have a minimum wage. And they're setting maximum weekly hours to work. And that's where today you have, for example, overtime. Okay, so if you've worked as that maximum number of weekly hours, then at certain times and places and whatever applies to that, there's all sorts of legalities and so on. But they do have to pay overtime at certain times and for certain cases. Now, you're going to see that the NRA is going to have a blue eagle as its signal. Okay, it's going to be what you see in a window. If you're a member, if you're one of the businesses that supports the National Recovery Administration, then you are going to put this poster on your store window, on your door. You're going to put it on ads that you run in the newspapers, trying to get people to come in there. Okay, people like the NRA, they like the Blue Eagle. Now, another thing that they're doing, though, is they're also creating some minimum prices by which products could be sold. Now, that's another one. That's a rough one because of deflation, because of the fact that so many people don't have the money to even buy things that were way overstocked and therefore extremely cheap. The whole idea of minimum prices to sell things, that was going to really help the businesses, at least if people could afford to do that. So anyway, I want you to know that this is part of the early New Deal, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt believes that this is something that is worldwide, right? But he believes that, because it was worldwide, but he believes that we can do things in our country to help mitigate the damage from the Depression. So he believed that the stock market and the market instability that had started and then led to the crash and all that, he believed that that particular thing, the instability of the economy, was the major cause of the Great Depression. Therefore, that's how he's going to attack it. Okay, he's going to try to work on that. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, is going to believe very strongly in government intervention. Okay, so don't forget about that. That's part of one of the early things he did. Now, a couple of other early things that FDR did was he actually is going to have a bank holiday. Okay, bank holiday. That's a great idea, absolutely brilliant. So right after his inauguration in March, I believe it was March. It was still that kind of a bit of time, I think, in between. But anyway, not long after he was inaugurated, FDR is going to call for a bank holiday. Okay, because people had been trying to get their money out of the banks, and remember, all these banks are closing. And so on March 6, 1933, he shuts down the banking system. They're not going to open again until March 13th. Okay, so again, this was actually quite brilliant because on March 12th, he's going to have what we call a fireside chat. Okay, this is the first of his fireside chats. He's going to have these all the time through his presidency on the radio. So he's using the radio. Remember, commercial radio is very new as of 1920, as I've reminded you before. So he's going to tell people that, you hear people from that era. If you listen to people from that era who can remember that, they say that it felt like he was right there talking to them. Because, see, remember, radio's new to them also. So he's talking to them about the fact that their money is going to be safer in the reopened banks than it would be by hoarding it in their homes. Okay, so he says, just bring your money back. We guarantee that it is actually going to be safe. Now, what they're looking at too at this point, we've got the Emergency Banking Act, which was passed during that time period, during those days, on March 9th. So the Emergency Banking Act was also going along with all of this, a stroke of genius that worked. So what the Emergency Banking Act did was pretty much, it was going to basically set up some Federal Reserve banks. Okay, there's at that time we see right at that moment they're talking about what they're going to do, and the idea is we're going to set up these certain banks to be Federal Reserve banks. Those are regional banks for the Federal Reserve System, the central banking system of the United States. Okay, now why are there 12? There's one for each of the 12 districts that were created by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Okay, remember, that's why I always say it's harder to figure out inflation if you go past 1913 back into the past and you're using the inflation counter, for example, because the Fed, set up right there in 1913. So here in 1933, those banks are going to be set up and they are going to be allowed to issue additional currency. Okay, now the thing is, everybody was running and trying to get their money out, like I said, from the banks. And this is meant to be a guarantee to make people not so scared that their money won't be there. Okay, so the Emergency Banking Act is going to be passed on March 9th, the same day that it was actually brought into Congress, if I'm not mistaken. And it's going to be passed in a joint session of the House and Senate. And this is also best known as one of his first and earliest projects in the first 100 days. Now, he's the one who gives us that term that sometimes we use about presidents will say, well, in their first 100 days. And you hear that quite a lot. But it was FDR who kind of gave them on the radio, gave them insight into what he did his first 100 days. So anyway, after the bank holiday, and then the Fed is going to be, the Federal Reserve banks are going to be kind of co-opted to get a lot of currency out there. And the other thing that's still around is that you have some insurance again. We still have the FDIC as something that insures your money that's in a federal bank. It's in a bank that if for some reason the banks do, something goes wrong, okay, so the banks do go belly up or whatever, that there is a guarantee from the government up to a certain amount per person. Okay, so the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So remember all those. Okay, now let's get into the Tennessee Valley Authority. The TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, is going to be one of FDR's great projects that had started early on. And he's going to set up a lot of different things, as we're going to talk about. This one was created in 1933, early on. And the Tennessee River Valley had a lot of problems. They had erosion, they had, flooding, which is going to contribute to the erosion, and deforestation. So the TVA is going to help reduce those problems. What they're doing is they're coming in, they're paying people to work for the Tennessee Valley Authority, as they call it, to come in and teach people better farming methods, to replant trees in the area where there had been heavy deforestation, and they're going to build dams. Now, why it's so very important, I mean, those things are important, but it's also going to generate electricity. And it's going to generate electricity and be able to give people a good price. So what's going to happen is it's going to create jobs, yes. It's going to conserve water power with the dams, yes. Okay, it's generating this electricity, so a lot of people in some poor areas are going to be able to actually get electricity much earlier than they probably would have. So Tennessee and Alabama were the ones that it was mainly focused in. But you also have other states like Kentucky and North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia that are actually going to benefit also from some of the TVA's work. So the Tennessee Valley Authority has got good and bad, as everything does. And I guess when you look at the PowerPoint, you're going to see it becomes the nation's biggest producer of electricity and builds more than 20 dams and all that. The opposite of the NRA. Remember, that's what I talked about just a minute ago with lecture. What was the NRA? Remember the Blue Eagle and all that. This is going to be government planning as opposed to being led by the capitalists, the public, the private sector. And you're going to have the government deciding what to do in this area. So anyway, it really did help in many ways. Government got in there, big government brought some prosperity to the region, but the criticisms, again, there's good and bad to everything. Criticisms. The region that these men were working in was still overall very poor, okay? And the prejudice, the racism that they were experiencing in those days, they didn't really want to hire any black men to work on the TVA. So again, there's always good, there's always bad. But TVA was one of the early things that FDR was doing in order to intervene. And also, as I said, when there's good, there's going to be bad. When there's something that comes out, there's going to be critics. So we do have opposition to the New Deal. And that's going to come from both sides. Okay? Both left and right wing groups are going to be opposed to it. Now, you're going to have more from the conservatives on the right side because they're going to call what FDR is doing socialist. They're going to say that they're spending recklessly. So you remember Herbert Hoover was a Republican, and he didn't want to spend very much money on these programs of big government. So he's also going to be attacked. FDR is going to also be attacked by the right wing, where they're going to say not only is it socialism, but you're attacking free enterprise at its core. Okay. Now on the left, usually what's going to happen is they're going to say you're not going far enough. We want you to go further to the left. In other words, bigger government, bigger government, bigger government. So when we talk about popular protests, there's two guys that I want you to be aware of. The first one is Dr. Francis Townsend, and he's going to be known for the Townsend Plan. So Francis Townsend was a doctor. He's a guy who came up with the idea of with one of his colleagues, with this idea of an old age pension. Now it has some limitations to it and everything. So first of all, it's going to be basic in that if you're over 60 years old, then you should be paid $200 a month. Okay. So his idea was this old age pension was going to be supported by a 2% national sales tax. Now, only requirements to be beneficiaries for the Townsend Plan was you had to be 60 or over. You have to be retired. You can't be a criminal. You can't have a record. And you have to spend all the money you get every month. Now, that's to put money back in the economy, and that is not a bad idea, right? Not a bad idea at all. So Townsend is going to actually become as a let's see, he was born, I guess he was probably in his 60s when he thought of this actually, and he's going to work with a friend of his, but he's going to be known for writing some letters, and he's going to look out the door, he said, and saw two old ladies, he called them, that were dressed in old clothes looking through his garbage cans for food. And he just decided that, we've got to do something about it. So we have President Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. Now, this is a woman, Frances Perkins. Okay. She's the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet, Frances Perkins. Okay. Anyway, she is going to write about this in her book about Roosevelt. Okay. She's going to write about the Townsend Plan. And she says that FDR told her, we have to have this. We have to have an old age plan. You know, Congress can't stand the pressure of the Townsend Plan unless we have a real old age insurance. Okay. So what happens then is Social Security Act is going to pass in 1935, and it's going to be a little bit different because the Social Security Act is going to be, well, the Social Security Act is not going to be based on a 2% sales tax or any kind of a sales tax. It's not going to be revolving in that sense. But Congress is going to be putting in a pay-as-you-go kind of insurance. Okay, Social Security insurance. You've worked and they take out money from your paycheck. And then when you get to a certain age, you're going to actually be able to collect Social Security. Okay. Now, again, when it passes, when the Social Security Act passes in 1935, it wasn't meant to be your sole income. Okay. It was also meant to be something that you do spend. When I was a social worker for a very long, felt like a long time, wasn't that long, just a couple of years. But when I was a social worker, there were people that got SSI and they had to spend that money, most of it every month. You had a certain amount of money you could put in the bank, but they still, it's still supposed to go back into the economy in a large part. So the Social Security Act is going to do more than just what Townsend had called for, not just the old age benefits for the workers, but it's going to give you a workman's comp that we didn't have before. That's all part of the Social Security Act. Unemployment insurance is part of the Social Security Act. And the WIC and all of those type of programs, they're going to come from this. Okay, so again, you can get, if you're disabled, you can get some money in lieu of working and all of that. So all of those pieces of the Social Security Act are going to be important to us today because we're used to that. We're used to having all those. So the other guy I want to acquaint you with, as far as protest and kind of trying to push the government in the direction of more help, or maybe in some cases less help, but usually what we're going to see with Townsend was we ended up with something much bigger. Now, Charles Coughlin is a priest, and he's going to be on the radio using it for, well, how shall I put this? Okay, he's going to become politicized. He had been a really big advocate of FDR's New Deal at first. And then at some point, he had decided that it just wasn't doing what he thought it should do. Okay. So he's going to be, he's on the other side calling for, hey, you're doing this pseudo capitalist measure, and we don't have enough cash, and he's proposing all kinds of monetary reforms and all kinds of stuff. It gets so bad that Charles Coughlin is going to be endorsing FDR in 1932, and he's going to be very supportive. But at some point, he had gotten the ear of President Roosevelt. So he would call President Roosevelt and talk to him. And at some point now, FDR got tired of that because here's this guy telling him what to do. And finally, FDR said, cut him off. I don't want to talk to this guy anymore. So basically, he becomes politicized. He is he is also a guy in the 1930s who is going to support some of the anti-Semitism of, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, which is really kind of very sad. And he's going to try to also support having a more fascist agenda in the United States. Okay. So, I mean, he's going way out there. He's going to be using the slogan social justice. Now, we talk about social justice today. People who are of one kind of persuasion politically talk about social justice. We're trying to get equality and distribute wealth and opportunities and social privileges. And you hear on the other side, people talk about social justice warriors with disdain. Okay, so he's going to use the slogan social justice. So anyway, he is going to get one of the largest radio audiences in American history. Okay, he's going to have somewhere between 25 and 35 million listeners every week to his program. It gets to the point that people are rescheduling things, like his say program was on maybe at 2 in the afternoon on Sunday. You would have people that would reschedule basketball games or baseball games or whatever so they could be at home and watch this guy. So by 1934, he was getting over 10,000 letters every day. He had to hire all kinds of people, maybe a couple of hundred people, to help him. So, what's going to happen with him is he starts to get more and more vocal with his opposition to FDR. He calls the president, he calls him a puppet of Wall Street and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so in 1935, he decides that he is going to actually maybe start a political party of his own. Now, his political party is going to gain some traction. He is going to have, quite a few people who are going to join his political party, but it's never going to go any further, really, than Father Coughlin. He was a character. He was a character that you wanted to listen to just to see what he was going to say next. So we see, remember we've seen censorship in, remember World War I, we saw censorship. We're going to see it in World War II as well, because FDR is going to have Father Coughlin's wildly erratic, by that time, radio show canceled. Remember, he's showing a little bit too much, what would the word be? He's showing a little bit too much leanings towards some fascist, like Hitler and Mussolini, okay? Because Coughlin has gone so far against communism that he's going to go and embrace fascism, which is a very interesting thing that he was doing. So, terrible thing. Anyway, he's going to end up with his radio show finally canceled. Now, his political party was the National Union for Social Justice, and when his radio show was canceled, they also forbade him from sending out his magazine or pamphlets or anything that had to do with social justice. So again, this is a very powerful man. He had one of the largest radio audiences in American history, consistent radio audience. So he did wield quite a bit of power. So slide, slide number 17. We've got Huey Long. I'd almost forgotten about him being on here too, as one of the people who's protesting that the New Deal's not gone far enough. He's nicknamed the Kingfish, and he's going to use the radio all the time as his tool to get to the people. And he proposes this alternate New Deal called Share Our Wealth Plan. Okay, basically take the the riches of the wealthy and then use those riches to give every family an income. Now, basically, he would say, his platform was something like annual incomes are going to be limited to like $1 million, and they would have a certain amount of money you could inherit. Now, every family is going to be given an allowance to pay for their home. Every family is also going to be guaranteed a family income. Okay. And they based it on the average family income and all that stuff. He has built in there an old age pension for people over 60. He has veterans getting a pension and health care. And he has free education and training for all students so they could be, able to go to school, college, university, trade school, any of that. So those are some of the main things. Now, he believed that the big cause of the Great Depression was that wealth gap that we've talked about between the rich and everybody else. And so he was well liked by the people. And his plan was to run for president. Now, he's going to run for president, at least from where he's sitting there as Louisiana's governor. But he's not going to actually be able to run for president, in fact, because he's actually killed, assassinated in 1935, okay, before he had a chance to even go out there officially run for president. So who knows what he would have done if he would have been president or not. So it seems like a lot of his ideas sound very familiar, at least for one of the candidates. I think that recently dropped out. Some of those are pretty familiar for Bernie Sanders, in my opinion, some of them at least. Under FDR, government keeps getting bigger, and he starts putting out there more ways to help people by giving them jobs and other things. Now, first of all, we have FERA. Early, again, this is early stuff, 1933, FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration. That'll give cash grants, which means you don't have to pay them back, to states to help prop up bankrupt relief agencies. Okay, this is the days before we have food stamps and other ways to get help. Notice today, too, if you watch the news, you pay attention, unemployment insurance, unemployment has just skyrocketed right here in April of 2020 during the COVID pandemic, that it's taking so long even for the state of Kentucky to pay all the unemployment and get everything kind of squared away. So imagine you don't even have that back then. So there's people literally starving on the streets, homeless people. So the cash grants to the states are supposed to help these relief agencies that would try to provide food and so on, things to help them. Now, the director, Harry Hopkins, probably wasn't the best guy to be in charge of FERA, because Harry Hopkins is known, I just put a little piece of his quote there, for saying something that ended in, this FERA thing, it will probably undermine the independence of many. In other words, he believed that men, and I guess women, but mostly men, head of the household, all that stuff, but he believed that it would undermine the men to the point where they would feel emasculated, and to the point where if they got used to getting on the dole, again, that was the old-timey way, sometimes they referred to welfare or federal relief, where the government was helping you. He was afraid that they might get used to it, or that it would make them go the complete opposite direction, where they were so embarrassed that they would, either leave their family, which did happen actually a lot. You did have a lot of men during the Great Depression that did leave their families because they couldn't take care of them, and for whatever reasons they left. So anyway, a little bit after this, you have the Civil Works Administration, 1933 also. This is work relief. Now, Hopkins said about this one, he says, oh, well, this will preserve man's morale. So most people are more comfortable with this. we're not living in a time in the Great Depression where people are used to taking things. Okay. Again, there's not even unemployment insurance. You get whatever reason laid off, it's up to you to figure out what you're going to do next. And there's no social safety net there. So anyway, they're going to be able the um, through the CWA, Civil Works Administration, too many acronyms, the Civil Works Administration, they're going to put 4 million people to work on temporary projects. Some of them were just busy work. Hey, send them out there to clean up this area, literally go pick up this thing, maybe paint, do some painting over here. But some of them were lasting value. Either way, it gave money in the it put money in the pockets of several million families. So they wanted to prime the pump of the economy with government spending. Okay, that's a reference to old wells, of which I have never used to my knowledge. Maybe I've seen it at some historical place. But the old wells, where you would have to actually, pump a little bit before water would start coming out. So they're wanting to prime the pump. In other words, get the economy started with government money, that the money that's been given to workers, so the workers would spend it back in the economy, which makes me think of the stimulus checks that we're supposed to be getting from our government today. And in reality, most people who get the stimulus checks today are probably going to spend them on bills, or stuff that's not going to be like, well, I'm going to take that and I'm going to go out and buy a new TV or something like that. Okay, so anyway, back then, 1933, they're trying to prime the pump. Now, FERA and CWA are going to be temporary, and they're going to be gone by 1935. Okay, so there's going to be other things that are coming in. Now, the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, okay, another, too many acronyms, I'm going to stop saying that. But anyway, it's going to give employment to a lot of men in the cities. And they're going to have a lot of conservation and reforestation. It allows no women, and it's in a semi-military environment. You have to live in barracks. So, yeah, I mean, you do. You have to live in barracks. No women allowed. Now, they're going to be doing all kinds of different things. Again, conservation is in the name. So they're planting trees, building reservoirs, developing parks, and all this. Now, they did offer black men some jobs, but they were segregated. And the jobs, as far as I recall, were pretty scarce for the black men. So, in spring of 1935, we have what's called the Second New Deal. And that's because there's only one New Deal, remember? And what happens is it starts out with certain programs, and they're trying everything they can, or everything they can think of. And then the Second New Deal is going to be a response to go even more so toward helping, you know, different people. For example, the change is going to be in the emphasis. What are we doing here? Okay. So there was political pressure, like I told you before in the beginning, from all sides. And the biggest problem was what FDR and company had done so far had not really lessened the Great Depression. Okay. It was still rolling along. So what are they going to do? Well, we start to see the attitude toward big business, attack on corporate interest coming up. That's going to be a big thing at this time. And we end up with a series of tax reforms in 1935 that conservatives called soak the rich, okay, which is pretty much what it is, because they were going to put a 70 to 75% taxation on the highest tax bracket. And it didn't really have an effect, though, because there were so few people in that tax bracket. So, I mean, the intention was to soak the rich, kind of like Share the Wealth from Huey Long. but there weren't enough people making that much money or having that much, or well, actually, without maybe hiding it in some kind of tax shelters or something, it didn't really have an effect. So remember, Social Security Act is going to be passed in 1935, and we talked about some of the things that were also included in there. So let's look at this again briefly. Now, the thing about the Social Security Act is if you're elderly, if you're over 60, 60 or over, and you need it immediately, you can get $15 per month. Okay, you can do your inflation calculator and see how much that would be today. I don't know, maybe it's equivalent to about 200 or something. I'm just doing that on the top of my head. I wouldn't swear by it. But what the way that this works is working Americans contribute to the future federal pension plan called Social Security. So it's based on the younger people, the people that are working now, contributing money, getting it taken from our paychecks, okay, and it's going to the Social Security plan. And the people who retire are going to be collecting the money. It is a revolving plan in this way. They're going to be collecting the money that's coming in from us now. Okay, so they're contributing to a federal pension plan, and it's going to be easy to see how there could be problems with that. There was a time a few years ago where they were afraid the Social Security pension was going to be depleted and there wasn't going to be any for people of a certain age. Well, it turned out, I mean, the baby boomers, that's the ones they were worried about. The boomers, such a big, massive behemoth group. And then there was Gen X, my generation, and we're so much smaller. We're the smallest of the generations. And so part of the problem was there weren't enough of us when we were working, as we were first starting out and so on. There weren't going to be enough of us to put enough money into that Social Security, that into this plan, that the older people would get it once they got to the age. And then, check it out. Then the millennials came and they're another behemoth. They're enormous. So, yeah, Social Security, we don't usually hear too much about it being in trouble recently anyway. Now, the pension payments could begin in 1940, okay, 5 years later, for people who are retiring, okay, again, unless you immediately needed it. It also creates, as I said before, unemployment insurance and workman's comp and all that. And what they want is insurance, not something given out, like, as they would say, welfare. So the last slide on the Great Depression New Deal PowerPoint here, the last one is where we talk about the WPA, which is one of the most magnificent things they did. It's going to give work relief for unemployed, just like the CWA had done before. Harry Hopkins again, he's the director. He likes this because you're putting people to work. Now, it's going to be very successful. It keeps this average of 2.1 million workers employed for 6 years or so. And they're going to be doing very necessary infrastructure work. Okay. So they're building and renovating over 110,000 libraries, post offices, schools. Okay. Again, this is between 35 and 1941. So a lot of the schools when I was a kid in the 70s, wow, they weren't that old in the 70s. So a lot of those schools and libraries and stuff that I saw when I was a kid were built by the WPA workers, okay? They're going to build 600 airports, 500,000 miles of roads, 100,000 bridges, and so on. And it's giving, though, money to unemployed workers to stimulate the economy in also some very flexible ways. For example, if you were a writer and you were out of a job, they would give you a job writing, doing what you do. They put a lot of historians like me, if I was out of a job as a historian or something, history professor, they're like, okay, well, we'll put you to work doing something to do with history. So the time here between 35 and 41, is so amazing for history because we're able to collect, I don't know how many oral histories from people, from older people who tell us what it was like back when they were younger. Okay, and you get some from people who were born in slavery. You get some very, elderly people who talk about that. So that's invaluable to us in history. And then my dad, who was born in 1918, he actually went and worked for the NYA, the National Youth Administration, for a while. And he left high school. He didn't graduate high school. He had to, get his GED later. And he went and he hopped on he was born up in Illinois. And he went and he was raised in Illinois. But he went and he hopped on a train and he went to California. Okay. He was one of those guys that was riding the rails, going out there looking for work. He didn't see his mom for like 2 years. He sent money home when he had money to send to them. So he had quit high school. He worked for the NYA, and then he decided it was better to strike off on his own. And there were 5 children. My dad was he was the youngest. No, I'm sorry. Let's see. He was the oldest boy, and then he had sisters. He had brothers. But anyway, he's going to be gone, and during that time, he's getting jobs doing whatever he could, because again, this is the time where you're going to take any job that will put any kind of food on your table for yourself and your family. And that's the end. So before the test, you need to have listened to the Roaring Twenties, taken notes, both of those PowerPoints, and then all of this one, taken notes. And again, trying to make sure that the questions that are on there are from things we've talked about. So I go back and I kind of look at the test, and I look at, what I've said in lecture, and make sure that there's nothing really different. Now, one thing that I want you to know is we didn't really talk about this with the international debt structure of the 1920s. One of the big problems with the Great Depression, one of the things that kind of caused it, was this international debt structure. Now, I did talk about it a little bit, but what I want you to know about it now, you need to write this down, okay, is the European allies of the United States are actually going to, wait for it, this is just cracks me up every time. They are going to be allowed to borrow money from the United States to pay back the United States. What? Yes. Okay, don't forget that because it's so insane, but that's what we did. Okay, we allow our allies to borrow money from us to pay us back. So again, that doesn't take much thought to see. There's something a little bit strange about that. I'm also right now, literally, I'm checking to see what else is on there. Okay, I want you to know about Dale Carnegie's book. It was a self-help manual. It was teaching you how to be individually strong and motivated. Okay, Andrew Carnegie is not related to this guy. This is Dale Carnegie. Okay, a self-help manual for individual incentive. Now, I mentioned the Grapes of Wrath, I believe, at some point, but just in case I didn't, The Grapes of Wrath was a book and a movie. The book was written at the time of the Depression, and it's going to tell the story of people going from the Dust Bowl to California because they're looking for work. It's a great movie. Again, there's another movie if you can find it and want to watch it. It's a great movie, but it was a book first. Okay. Another thing I wanted to tell you before we finish up with the Great Depression was FDR had an advising team that was made up of professors, and they called that the BRAIN, or the Brains Trust. Okay. Another thing Herbert Hoover and FDR felt very differently about was that FDR believed it was a worldwide depression, but he believed he could make changes in the United States, real changes through government. Okay, so that's an important one too. Difference between their, their approaches. Okay, what else? What else? Let me do this while I got you here listening, hopefully. Um, okay, now I want you to know that the New Deal, when FDR used the phrase that he wanted to give a New Deal to the American people, then he didn't really explain what it was. And the reason that I'm telling you that is because this election was FDR's to lose, okay? He had to make some really big mistakes if he lost the election of 1932. Okay, he's offering a new deal to the American people, but he's very vague intentionally, right? He doesn't want to say the wrong thing and turn off the wrong person, and they won't vote for him. So he's intentionally vague about that. And what else? What else? Was there anything else we didn't talk about? Nope, 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 nope. Nope, I think we're pretty good with that. You're going to have the short answer questions again too. So, the Scopes trial and the conflict of cultures, and then you can compare and contrast Hoover and FDR's approaches to solving the Great Depression. But you're going to only have to answer one. Okay, so you're going to have to do a pretty good, going to have to do a pretty good job. You can even get online tutors from the college to check it for you, your rough draft, before you turn it in to me. Okay. So again, I'm going over the actual test, and I don't think I see anything that we did not specifically discuss on this lecture. I'm not saying it's, anywhere else. It's based on lecture. So good luck and all of that stuff. And I will hopefully see you guys again with the next round of PowerPoints. That will be World War II.